The sheriff said she was nothing, a body to be sold or buried. But one man's hand reached through the silence, and with it, the whole town's laughter stopped. The sun hung low over the town that day, its light falling flat against the dust and the cracked boards of the saloon porch, where men leaned with folded arms, watching the scene unfold as though it were sport. On the ground by the hitching rail sat a woman, thin as winter twigs, her dress clinging to her frame, her belly round and heavy with child. She did not lift her eyes when the townsfolk jeered. She did not flinch when children pointed and laughed, calling her names they had heard whispered by their parents. She only sat, her back curved, her hair matted, her hands wrapped tight over the place where new life stirred inside her. The sheriff stood nearby, his thumbs hooked in his belt, chewing slow and hard like the sight bored him more than it shamed him. He cleared his throat and spat, saying loud enough for the crowd to hear that someone ought to buy her or bury her, that he had no patience for a half-dead stray wasting air in his town. The laughter rippled through the crowd, harsh and cutting. One man offered a single coin. Another shook his head and muttered that not even a hungry dog would take her in. The woman said nothing, not even when the sheriff nudged her shoulder with the tip of his boot. Her eyes stayed fixed on the dust at her feet, hollow and lifeless, as if every cruel word spoken had already been carved into her. The moment stretched long and ugly, until the creak of wagon wheels broke the silence. A tall man stepped down, his hat pulled low, his face lined with the wear of years spent alone under sun and wind. Elijah Hale was known in town as the rancher who kept to himself, a man who came for supplies and left without wasting words. Few could remember the last time he had sat in a saloon or lingered at Sunday service. He moved with the steady quiet of someone who had long ago learned not to expect kindness from the world. He looked at the woman, not quick and passing as the others had, but with a gaze that stayed. Something in the hollow of her eyes caught him, something that was not weakness, but a tiredness deeper than bone. The sheriff smirked when Elijah stepped forward, asking if he aimed to waste good money on bad stock. Elijah reached into his coat, pulled out 2 crumpled bills, and laid them on the crate by the post. No one laughed this time. The sheriff picked them up, his eyes narrowing, but he said nothing more. The woman's shoulders twitched, the smallest sign of breath catching in her chest, though she still did not look up. Elijah did not speak to the crowd, did not defend his choice. He only reached down and held out his hand. For a moment she did not move. Then slowly, with trembling fingers, she let him lift her to her feet. The dust swirled around them as the town watched in silence, and together they walked toward his wagon, leaving behind the echo of laughter that no longer belonged to her. The wagon wheels groaned as Elijah led the woman toward it, his hand steady under her elbow, though she tried to pull away at first, her body stiff with mistrust. She climbed onto the wooden bench with slow, careful movements, clutching her belly as though the child inside might slip from her if she let go even for a moment. Elijah did not speak. He only secured the reins and gave the horses a soft click of his tongue. The team moved forward, their hooves striking the dirt in a rhythm that filled the silence stretching wide between them. She sat hunched, her eyes darting from the town fading behind them to the vast emptiness ahead, her breath shallow, her mind racing with memories of rough hands and cruel laughter, waiting for the moment when this quiet rancher would reveal himself to be no different from the rest. The sun dropped lower, painting the land in a tired gold, the air heavy with dust kicked up by the wheels. Elijah kept his gaze on the road, his jaw set, his hat shading the lines carved into his face by years of work and weather. Now and then he shifted, adjusting the reins, but he did not glance at her, did not ask questions, did not make demands. The woman whispered under her breath, words too soft for him to hear, but her lips moved against the air like prayers. She pressed her palms over the swell of her stomach and murmured to the life inside, telling it to hold on, telling it she would not give up even if the world wanted her to. Her voice cracked with the effort, and she turned her face away so Elijah would not see the tears that slipped free. The road grew rough, jostling the wagon, and she winced at every bump, biting down on her lip until it bled. Elijah noticed her shivering, though the air was warm. Without a word, he reached behind the bench and pulled out a wool blanket. Worn but clean, the edges frayed from years of use. He set it gently across her lap. She froze, her eyes flashing with alarm, her body bracing as if this were some trick, some way to trap her. Her breath quickened, and she gripped the wood of the seat, waiting for his hand to close hard around her arm. But it never came. He had already turned back to the reins, his attention steady on the trail ahead, his body language quiet and unthreatening, as if the simple act of offering warmth was nothing to remark upon. Slowly she loosened her grip, her fingers trembling as she drew the blanket around her shoulders. The wool smelled faintly of smoke and sage, carrying with it the strange comfort of a home she did not yet know. She sank against the seat, clutching the fabric to her chest, her heart pounding not from fear now, but from confusion at kindness that asked for nothing in return. The horses kept their pace. Elijah's silence remained unbroken, and as the sky deepened toward twilight, she closed her eyes and breathed, unsure if safety was real, but knowing that for the first time in years, she wanted to believe it could be. The wagon rolled through the wide valley until the land broke into a scatter of cottonwoods and low hills, and there at the edge of a pasture stood a cabin, weathered gray by sun and storm, its roof patched with shingles of different colors, its porch sagging but still holding firm against the wind. A small barn leaned beside it, fences stretching outward with posts worn smooth from years of rope and cattle pressing. The woman sat upright, her eyes wide and cautious, taking in the place that might be her prison or her shelter. Elijah drew the team to a stop, climbed down without a word, and offered her his hand. She hesitated, gripping the blanket tighter around her shoulders, but at last let him steady her to the ground. The earth smelled of dust and hay, and somewhere nearby a cow lowed softly, the sound strange and almost tender after the noise of the town. He led her toward the cabin and pushed open the door. The hinges creaked, but the room inside was clean, the floor swept, a fire faint in the hearth. Shadows stretched long across the walls, where the evening light seeped through cracks in the shutters. She stood just inside the threshold, wary of crossing too far, while Elijah moved about the room with the calm of a man who had repeated these motions countless nights. He pointed toward a narrow bed tucked against the wall, its quilt faded but neatly spread. Then he turned to a shelf, set down a tin plate and a cup, and filled them with beans and cornbread from a pot kept warm near the fire. He placed the plate on the table, slid a chair out, and stepped back as if making room for her. Her stomach clenched at the smell, hunger tearing through her with sudden force, yet she did not move right away. She waited, tense, certain that at any moment he would close the space between them, lay down the cost of his so-called kindness in the way men always did. But Elijah only stood with his hands loose at his sides, his gaze steady but not pressing. Slowly, she shuffled forward, lowered herself into the chair, and picked up the spoon. Her hands shook so badly, the beans nearly spilled before they reached her mouth. She ate fast, as if the food might be snatched away, as if he might change his mind. Between bites her eyes flicked toward him, bracing for the demand, but he only turned toward the hearth, poked at the coals, and then walked to the door. Before leaving, he glanced back once, his face unreadable in the dim firelight, and said nothing. Then the door closed behind him, leaving her alone with the meal, the blanket still around her shoulders, and the bed waiting in silence. She swallowed hard, staring at the door, the fear inside her knotting tighter, because she did not understand a man who asked for nothing. The food warmed her belly, the shadows shifted on the walls, and as she lay down at last, she whispered to the child inside her that maybe, just maybe, they had not been brought here to be broken again. The next evening the smell of stew filled the small cabin, thick with potatoes and bits of venison that Elijah had taken from the smokehouse. The woman sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders as though she feared the warmth might be taken if she let go. Elijah moved with steady steps, ladling the food into 2 bowls, setting one before her and one across the table, where he took his seat. The silence stretched as it always did, yet tonight it felt different, heavy but not sharp, more like a space that had been waiting too long to be filled. She lifted her spoon with trembling fingers, tasting carefully, her hunger obvious but her movements slow, as if she still expected the meal to come at some hidden price. Elijah ate without hurry, his gaze never pressing, only flicking to her once in a while, as if to see whether she would take another bite. The stew was simple, the cabin plain, but the quiet between them carried an odd weight that she could not name. At last he spoke, his voice low and rough from disuse, saying only that once there had been another woman at this table, his wife, who had not lived to see the child she carried. The words hung in the air like smoke, and the woman felt her chest tighten with a pain that was not hers but reached her all the same. She lowered her spoon, unsure if she should answer. Yet Elijah's eyes stayed steady on the stew, not on her, as though he was not asking for comfort, but only speaking to keep the ghosts from swallowing the room. She looked around then, noticing for the first time the shelf with a single folded shawl, the empty rocking chair near the hearth, the little carved figure of a horse set high where dust had gathered around it. She realized the cabin was not just worn from weather but hollowed by loss, every board carrying the echo of someone gone. Her own losses weighed heavy too, but for a moment she understood that this man's silence was not cruelty, but grief that had learned to sit still. When he finally raised his head, his eyes met hers, calm and waiting, and he asked the simplest of questions, what her name was. She felt her throat close, the word caught behind fear, yet something in his steady gaze made her force it out. Nora, she whispered, so soft she thought he might not hear. But he nodded, slow and sure, as though he had been waiting years to hear any name spoken in his house again. She felt the sound of it settle in the air, fragile but real, and she clutched it like a small fire in the dark. The rest of the meal passed in quiet, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with 2 names, one gone and one given, and that small truth was enough to make her believe she might not be a ghost forever. The storm had been building all day, wind rattling the shutters and dust swirling through the cracks in the walls, when Nora felt the sharp pull in her belly that sent her breath quick and shallow. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her face pale beneath the glow of the lantern. The pains came fast, too soon, and fear gripped her harder than the ache itself. She whispered, "No, no, not now, not yet," tears streaking her cheeks as memories of loss pressed down like a weight. She had buried hope too many times before, and now she was certain she would bury it again. Elijah heard her cry and came rushing in from the porch, his hat still in his hand, his eyes wide in alarm. He dropped it to the floor and was at her side in an instant, steadying her as another wave bent her nearly double. He did not know what to do, but he moved anyway, fetching water from the kettle, gathering rags from the shelf, his rough hands shaking so badly he almost spilled everything. He cleared the bed and guided her down with clumsy gentleness, his face set in a grim line, though his eyes betrayed the fear racing through him. Nora clutched his arm, nails digging into his skin, begging the baby not to leave her, begging God not to take this one too. Elijah wiped her brow with a damp rag, whispering words that came out broken but steady enough to hold her through the worst of it. He told her to breathe, told her she was not alone, told her she could fight through it. Hours stretched like days, as thunder rolled across the hills and rain began to lash against the cabin. Nora screamed until her throat was raw, her body trembling with exhaustion, certain the end would swallow them both. Elijah never left her side, boiling water again and again, pressing cloths into her hands, whispering encouragement even as he trembled. When at last the final cry tore from her throat, it was joined by another sound, thin and piercing, the cry of a newborn girl. Nora collapsed back against the quilt, sobbing with relief, clutching the squirming, red-faced infant against her chest. She pressed her lips to the tiny head, whispering, thank you," over and over as the tears poured unchecked. Elijah stepped back, his chest rising and falling, like he had been the one fighting for every breath. He braced himself against the doorway, his shoulders shaking, his eyes wet for the first time in years. He watched Nora cradle the child as though she held all the light left in the world, her frail body wrapped around the small bundle like armor. The storm outside began to break, the thunder rolling farther away, leaving only the steady patter of rain on the roof. In that quiet, filled with the baby's soft cries and Nora's weeping, Elijah felt something stir in him that he thought had died with his own wife and child. He bowed his head, silent tears slipping down his weathered face, and for the first time in a long while he let them fall. The weeks after the baby's birth settled into a rhythm that was fragile but real. The cries in the night, the soft hum of lullabies that Nora barely remembered from her own childhood, the steady creak of Elijah's boots across the floorboards as he stoked the fire or brought in water. Yet beyond the walls of the cabin, the voices of others carried sharp and cruel. The neighbors who came by for cattle, trade, or who passed along the fence line never hid their smirks. They spoke low, but not so low that Nora could not hear, calling Elijah a fool for taking in a woman already ruined, saying no decent man would claim another man's seed, saying it was only a matter of time before she bled him dry and left. Some said she was no better than a whore. Others said Elijah's loneliness had broken his mind, and he had bought himself trouble that would shame his name until his grave. Nora heard it all, each word pressing into her like thorns. She held the baby close when the whispers reached her ears, burying her face against the soft, dark hair, tears pricking her eyes, because she knew too well that the world was quick to brand women and quicker still to discard them. She thought of leaving, thought of sparing Elijah the laughter and the judgment, though she had nowhere to go but back to the dirt and the hunger that had nearly killed her. Shame burned hot in her chest, heavier than the child she carried in her arms, and she began to walk with her head low, her voice caught in her throat, afraid to meet Elijah's eyes, for fear he might at last believe the words of the town. One evening, as the sun fell and shadows stretched long over the yard, she sat by the fire with the baby in her lap, her hands shaking as she tried to rock her to sleep. She whispered that they would not stay long, that they would find another place where laughter would not follow them, though even as she said it, her heart cracked with the lie. Elijah came in from the porch then, dust on his boots, his face tired but calm, and he heard the tremor in her voice. He stood there a moment, watching her with the baby pressed tight against her chest, and he understood what had been said outside his walls. He set his hat on the peg, crossed the room, and crouched down beside her, his voice low but firm as stone. He said only that she and the child would stay, that no mouth outside these walls would decide otherwise. Nora's breath caught, the tears spilling before she could stop them, and she shook her head, whispering that she was nothing but a burden. Elijah did not argue. He did not soften his words. He only repeated with the same steady finality that she and the child would stay. In his eyes she saw no shame, no pity, only a resolve she could not understand, but longed to believe. The baby stirred then, let out a small cry, and Elijah reached out his hand to steady the tiny fist, his rough fingers brushing so gently that Nora's chest ached. For the first time, she allowed herself to think that perhaps she was not a stranger in this house, but someone being claimed, not as property, but as family. The mornings came with soft light spilling over the valley, the mist curling low across the pasture as the rooster crowed and the hens clucked for grain. Nora stepped out of the cabin with the baby balanced on one hip, a tin scoop in her free hand, and scattered feed into the dirt. The chickens rushed in a flurry of wings, pecking and scratching, and the baby gave a small laugh at the commotion, the sound clear and bright enough to make Nora smile. She had not thought herself capable of smiling so easily again, yet the rhythm of the work steadied her. She hung clothes across the line, patched Elijah's worn shirts by the fire, and hummed lullabies to the child in the yard as the wind carried the scent of hay and dust across the land. Elijah never pressed her to do more than she chose. He rose before dawn, tending the cattle and mending fences, his shadow long against the rising sun. But he did not command her, did not treat her help as duty. He let her move at her own pace, and in that quiet allowance she found herself doing more than she expected, as though the work grew from her naturally rather than being demanded. Some days were hard, the baby restless, her body weary, her mind haunted by the sting of old words. But Elijah never scolded when she faltered. He set food on the table without comment, repaired the roof when the rain leaked through, and when she tried to lift more than her strength allowed, he only shook his head and took the weight himself. His silence was not cold but patient, a space that gave her room to grow. She began to find small comfort in the smell of stew simmering on the stove, in the sound of Elijah chopping wood in the yard, in the sight of the baby sleeping safe in the cradle he had built with his own hands. One evening she carried a pail of water from the creek, her back aching, her hair loose and tangled from the day's work. She set the pail down and bent over the basin to wash her hands, and the water rippled until her reflection steadied. She stared at the face looking back, expecting the same hollow eyes and shadowed skin that had once made children laugh and men turn away. But what she saw startled her. The woman in the water was thin still, her cheeks sunburned, and her hair rough, yet her shoulders were straight, her gaze steady, and her mouth not twisted in shame, but softened by something close to peace. She touched her own cheek, as if to make sure it was real, and in that moment she no longer saw filth, but a woman standing upright again. Behind her the door creaked, and Elijah's boots sounded on the porch. She turned quickly, embarrassed, but he only nodded as he passed, carrying a bundle of firewood. He said nothing, but in his steady stride and quiet presence she felt an answer to the reflection she had just seen. She was not invisible here, not broken, not cast aside. She was beginning to belong, not because someone had told her so, but because she could finally see it for herself. The day was warm and still, the sky stretched wide and blue over the valley, when the sound of hooves broke the quiet rhythm of the ranch. Elijah had been in the yard mending a gate when he lifted his head, his hand pausing on the hammer, his eyes narrowing as a lone rider came fast up the trail. Nora was inside, rocking the baby in her arms, humming soft to calm her, when the barking of the dog and the pounding of hooves sent her heart into her throat. She stepped to the window and froze. The man on the horse was tall and lean, his hat crooked, his face half hidden by stubble, but she knew him at once. Crane, the drifter who had left her for dead when hunger and shame became too much for him to bear. He swayed in the saddle, the glint of a whiskey bottle still wetted his belt, and when he reined in at the fence, his voice carried rough and mean across the yard. "I've come for what's mine," he shouted, his words slurred, but sharp enough to cut. He pointed toward the cabin, toward her, and laughed, a sound that made her blood run cold. Nora's knees weakened, her arms tightening around the baby, until the child whimpered. Memories of nights filled with curses and fists, of being left in the dirt with nothing but the life inside her, came rushing back so hard she could barely breathe. She stumbled backward, whispering to the baby that it would be all right, though her voice shook with fear. Elijah moved then, calm but steady, setting down the hammer and walking toward the fence. He didn't raise his voice, didn't rush, but every line of his body was drawn tight with readiness. He stopped in the yard, his boots planted firm in the dust, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on the man who dared to ride up drunk and claim what he had thrown away. His hand rested near the butt of his rifle, not yet drawn, but close enough that the message was clear. Crane sneered, spitting into the dirt, his voice growing louder as he mocked Elijah, for being fool enough to take in a woman no one else wanted. He called her names meant to strip her down to nothing, words so foul that Nora closed her eyes, pressing her cheek to the baby's soft hair as tears burned behind her lids. She thought Elijah might turn, might listen, might hand her over to rid himself of trouble, but instead, he stepped forward, his shadow stretching long in the late afternoon Sunday. "She's not yours," Elijah said, his voice low but steady, each word heavy as stone. She never was. The silence that followed was sharp, the kind of silence that hangs before thunder breaks. Crane's face twisted, his hand twitching toward the pistol at his hip, but Elijah's fingers brushed his rifle, and the threat was enough to hold him still. Nora opened her eyes then, trembling, and saw Elijah standing between her and the past that had nearly killed her. She had expected violence or judgment, but instead she saw something she had never been given before, someone who would not let the ghosts of her suffering claim her again. The yard lay quiet, except for the creak of leather and the restless snort of Crane's horse, as he leaned forward in the saddle, his mouth twisted in a cruel grin. His words dripped like poison, loud enough for Nora to hear from the doorway where she clutched the baby tight against her chest. He called her ruined, spat that she was nothing but a worn-out shell no man in his right mind would keep, and he laughed as he turned his jeers on Elijah, saying only a desperate fool would claim another man's leavings. The insults hit their mark, for Nora's face flushed hot with shame, and her body trembled so badly she thought her legs might give way. But Elijah did not flinch. He stood steady in the yard, broad shoulders set against the lowering sun, his jaw clenched, his eyes never leaving Crane. Elijah's voice carried calm but firm, words spoken like iron hammered straight. He said Nora was no man's property, never had been, never would be, and that if Crane thought he could come back and lay claim to her, he was a fool twice over. The stillness that followed cut deep, the air charged, like the moment before lightning splits the sky. Crane sneered, spit hitting the dirt between them, his hand twitching near the pistol on his hip. He muttered that Elijah could keep the whore if he wanted, but then his tone shifted, the venom sharpened, and he said he aimed to teach them both what happened when a man forgot his place. Nora's breath caught, fear slicing through her chest as she saw Crane's hand drop lower, fingers brushing the worn handle of his gun. She wanted to scream, to beg Elijah to step back, to hide, but no sound left her throat. The baby stirred and whimpered, and she pressed her cheek to the tiny head, praying the world would not end in blood at her feet. Crane's eyes narrowed, his grin savage as he started to draw. But Elijah was faster. His rifle came up in a single clean motion, no hesitation in his arm, no doubt in his stance. The shot rang out, echoing against the hills, scattering the hens in a flurry of wings. Crane's cry split the air as he lurched sideways in the saddle, clutching his arm where blood spilled through the fabric. His horse reared, nearly throwing him, and he fought to steady himself, cursing Elijah with every breath. "You'll pay for this," Crane spat, his face pale with pain but his eyes still burning with hate. He jerked the reins, the horse spinning, and as he rode off his threats carried on the wind, trailing behind him like smoke from a dying fire. Elijah lowered his rifle, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what had passed, but his expression stayed steady. Nora sagged against the doorframe, her knees weak, tears streaking her cheeks, as she realized the man who had once left her for dead had been turned away, not by begging, not by surrender, but by someone who had chosen to stand for her. In the fading light of the yard, with the baby safe in her arms and Elijah's shadow cast long against the dirt, Nora felt a small piece of her fear loosen, breaking apart like a chain rusted thin with time. The night settled heavy over the valley, the sound of crickets rising in the still air, the faint glow of the fire, the only light in the cabin. Nora sat on the floor near the hearth, the baby asleep in the cradle close by, her body bent forward, her hands clenched in her lap. The weight of the day pressed down on her chest until she could hardly draw breath. The sight of Crane's face, the sound of his laughter, The words he had thrown like stones. All of it came back sharp and cutting, and she could no longer hold herself together. Tears slid down her cheeks, soft at first, then harder, her shoulders shaking as the dam she had built over years of silence cracked wide open. She wept into her hands, her sobs muffled, ashamed even now of making noise, ashamed of being seen broken. Elijah sat in the chair across the fire, his hat on the peg, his rifle set aside, his face lined with the wear of the day. He said nothing, only watched her with a steady patience, as though he knew words could not stop the storm that needed to pass through her. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen, her voice came out hoarse, spilling truths she had buried deep. She told him of the hunger that had hollowed her, of the nights she begged for scraps and was given only scorn, of the man who had promised to keep her safe, then left her in the dirt like refuse. She spoke of the townsfolk who sneered when she passed, who whispered whore and worthless behind their hands, who laughed at the sight of her belly and said no child deserved to be born to such a mother. Her words tumbled fast, each one a wound ripped open, and when she was done, she bowed her head again, unable to look at him, certain that even he would see only ruin now. The fire popped, sparks drifting up the chimney, and in the silence her heart pounded like a drum of dread. But Elijah did not move away, did not shift in disgust, did not let the quiet turn sharp. At last, his voice broke the stillness, low and rough, as if each word was carved straight from the marrow of him. "You are not ruined," he said. "You are here." The simple truth of it struck her harder than any sermon or speech ever had. She blinked through her tears, her breath catching, and for the first time she felt the chain of shame loosen around her chest. All the years of being told she was nothing, all the voices that had convinced her she was broken beyond repair, crumbled before the weight of those few words. She was not ruined, she was alive. She was sitting here by the fire with her child safe and a man who had chosen not to turn away. She wept again, but this time the tears were different, lighter, like rain washing dust from parched earth. And as Elijah's steady gaze held hers across the fire, she felt something long buried break open inside her and begin, at last, to breathe. The seasons turned slow and sure, the heat of summer giving way to the crisp bite of autumn, the hills painted with gold and red before the winds stripped them bare. On the ranch, the days carried their own rhythm, the crow of the rooster, the creak of the barn door, the steady beat of work that never truly ended. Nora rose with the dawn, the baby balanced on her hip, her hair tied back, her steps stronger with each passing day. She learned to scatter seed for the hens, to carry water from the creek without spilling, to hang laundry across the line where the wind could dry it quick and clean. Elijah worked beside her, his silence steady as always, yet she began to hear a kind of comfort in it, a quiet that gave space for her laughter when it finally returned. The baby grew, chubby legs pushing her upright, tiny feet tottering across the packed dirt yard. Her first steps came on a bright morning, when Elijah was stacking wood and Nora was washing clothes. The child let go of the cradle rail and stumbled forward, arms flailing, falling into the dust with a squeal of delight. Nora dropped her work and scooped her up, her laughter ringing out clear and full, the sound startling even herself. Elijah turned at the noise, his eyes softening at the sight, and though no words passed his lips, the curve of his mouth held something close to pride. Whispers still drifted from the neighbors, carried by the wind like burrs that clung no matter how far you walked. Some still called her ruined, others muttered that Elijah was a fool for keeping her, but the words struck dull now. She no longer bowed her head when she walked into town for supplies, no longer let her shoulders sag beneath the weight of old shame. She held her child's hand in one and a basket of goods in the other, and when the stairs followed, she met them with eyes steady and clear. The townsfolk saw it, the change, though they did not speak of it, and the laughter that once chased her steps grew quieter as the months wore on. At night she sat by the fire with Elijah, mending clothes or shelling beans, the baby asleep nearby, and the silence between them no longer pressed sharp against her chest. Sometimes Elijah told her of the land, which years had been dry, which years had brought floods, and sometimes she told him of small memories from her girlhood, of her mother's songs, or the way the wind had carried the smell of lilacs in spring. Each word laid down like another stone in the foundation of something she had thought lost forever. When she looked at her reflection now, in the washwater or the creek, she no longer saw the hollow-eyed girl left to die, no longer heard only the cruel laughter of those who had scorned her. She saw a woman who worked the land, who held her child steady on new legs, who stood beside a man who asked nothing but gave much. The choice of staying was no longer a choice at all, for the life she was building was stronger than the whispers, and the home she had found was rooted deeper than the shame that once bound her. The air carried the cool bite of autumn, the kind that slipped under the skin, yet felt clean after a long summer's heat. The valley stretched wide beneath a sky washed in pale stars, and the lantern light from the yard cast a warm circle against the dark. Nora stood on the porch, the child nestled in her arms, the blanket tucked close around the little body. She swayed gently as she held her, humming under her breath, her eyes fixed on Elijah in the distance. He was bent at the fence line, hammer striking steady against the post, his shadow thrown long across the ground by the glow of the lantern he had set in the grass. His movements were slow but sure, a rhythm carved by years of work and solitude. Yet now, the silence of it no longer felt empty. Nora shifted the baby higher on her hip and pressed a kiss to her soft hair. The child stirred, then settled again, her breath warm against Nora's collarbone. Nora looked out over the land, the cabin behind her, the barn leaning against the dusk, and something deep in her chest loosened. She whispered the word home, testing it against her lips as though it were something foreign and new, as though she had never dared to claim it before. The sound of it trembled in the air, but it did not break. For the first time, the word fit. Elijah must have heard her, or perhaps he simply felt her gaze, because he lifted his head and looked back toward the porch. His face was shadowed beneath his hat, but the fire in his eyes caught the lantern glow, steady and unflinching. He nodded once, a simple gesture, but it carried more weight than any sermon or vow. Nora's throat tightened as she held his gaze, her heart swelling with the truth that they were not master and servant, not savior and debt, not what the town had tried to name them. They were two broken souls who had been given nothing but sorrow, yet had chosen to stay and build something together out of the scraps left behind. The wind rustled through the dry grass, the last leaves of the cottonwoods whispering as they clung to the branches. Nora breathed deep, the smell of earth and smoke and wood filling her lungs, and she felt her spine straighten, her shoulders draw back. She was no longer the woman who had sat in the dirt waiting to die, no longer the shadow who flinched at every laugh and cruel word. She was here, standing on a porch that was hers, holding a child who was hers, watching a man who had made room for her, not out of pity, but out of something truer. The hammering stopped, the lantern flame flickered in the wind, and Elijah straightened, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He stood there a moment, looking at her with the quiet strength that had carried them through storms, through whispers, through the weight of their own ghosts. Nora tightened her hold on the baby and smiled, soft but certain, because the life they had built was not measured by the world's judgment, but by their own worth. The night wrapped around them, not cold but close, and the word home settled fully in her chest, not borrowed, not broken, but wholly her own. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.